Not just a battle of competing interests. It was a competing vision of humanity. Nazi ideology sought to subjugate and humiliate and exterminate. It perpetrated murder on a massive scale, fueled by a hatred of those who were deemed different and therefore inferior. It was evil. The nations that joined together to defeat Hitler's Reich were not perfect. They had made their share of mistakes, had not always agreed with one another on every issue. But whatever God we prayed to, whatever our differences, we knew that the evil we faced had to be stopped. Citizens of all faiths and of no faith came to believe that we could not remain as bystanders to the savage perpetration of death and destruction. And so we joined and sent our sons to fight and often die, so that men and women they never met might know what it is to be free. In America, it was an endeavor that inspired a nation to action. A president who asked his country to pray on D-Day also asked its citizens to serve and sacrifice to make the invasion possible. On farms and in factories, millions of men and women worked 3 shifts a day, month after month, year after year. Trucks and tanks came from plants in Michigan and Indiana, New York and Illinois. Bombers and fighter planes rolled off assembly lines in Ohio and Kansas, where my grandmother did her part as an inspector. Shipyards on both coasts produced the largest fleet in history, including the landing craft from New Orleans that eventually made it here to Omaha. But despite all the years of planning and preparation, despite the inspiration of our leaders, the skill of our generals, the strength of our firepower, and the unyielding support from our home front, the outcome of the entire struggle will ultimately rest on the success of one day in June. Lyndon Johnson once said that there are certain moments when history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. D-Day was such a moment. One newspaper noted that we have come to the hour for which we were born. Had the Allies failed here, Hitler's occupation of this continent might have continued indefinitely. Instead, victory here secured a foothold in France. It opened a path to Berlin. It made possible the achievements that followed the liberation of Europe, the Marshall Plan, the NATO alliance, the shared prosperity and security that flowed from each. It was unknowable then, but so much of the progress that would define the 20th century on both sides of the Atlantic came down to a battle for a slice of beach only 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. More particularly, it came down to the men who landed here, those who now rest in this place for eternity, and those who are with us here today. Perhaps more than any other reason, you, the veterans of that landing, are why we still remember what happened on D-Day. You're why we keep coming back. For you remind us that in the end, human destiny is not determined by forces beyond our control. You remind us that our future is not shaped by mere chance or circumstance. Our history has always been the sum total of the choices made and the actions taken by each individual man and woman. It has always been up to us. You could have done what Hitler believed you would do when you arrived here. In the face of a merciless assault from these cliffs, you could have idled the boats offshore. Amid a barrage of tracer bullets that lit the night sky, you could have stayed in those planes. You could have hid in the hedgerows or waited behind the seawall. You could have done only what was necessary to ensure your own survival. But that's not what you did. That's not the story you told on D-Day. Your story was written by men like Zane Schlemmer of the 82nd Airborne, who parachuted into a dark marsh far from his objective and his men. Lost and alone, he still managed to fight his way through the gunfire and help liberate the town in which he landed, a town where a street now bears his name. It's a story written by men like Anthony Ruggiero, an Army Ranger who saw half the men on his landing craft drown when it was hit by shell fire just 1,000 yards off this beach. He spent 3 hours in freezing water and was one of only 90 Rangers to survive out of the 225 who were sent to scale the cliffs. And it's a story written by so many who are no longer with us, like Carlton Barrett. Private Barrett was only supposed to serve as a guide for the 1st Infantry Division, but he instead became one of its heroes. After wading ashore in neck-deep water, he returned to the water again and again and again to save his wounded and drowning comrades. And under the heaviest possible enemy fire, he carried them to safety. He carried them in his own arms. This is the story of the Allied victory. It's the legend of units like Easy Company and the All-American 82nd. It's the tale of the British people whose courage during the Blitz forced Hitler to call off the invasion of England. The Canadians, who came even though they were never attacked. The Russians, who sustained some of the war's heaviest casualties on the Eastern Front. And all those French men and women who would rather have died resisting tyranny than lived within its grasp. It is the memories that have been passed on to so many of us about the service or sacrifice of a friend or relative. For me, it is my grandfather, Stanley Dunham, who arrived on this beach 6 weeks after D-Day and marched across Europe in Patton's army. And it is my great-uncle, who was part of the 1st American Division to reach and liberate a Nazi concentration camp. His name is Charles Payne, and I'm so proud that he's with us here today.